All right, welcome everyone to our final Science on the Sound of 2024. Today, we've got a special guest here that you've probably seen on Redondo Beach or at the Mass Center. Ainsleigh McKinlay was our summer intern down here for our Marine Mammal Stewards program. So you probably interacted with her and talking about marine mammals. Well, today we've got her for Coastline to Classrooms and talking about how marine mammals are a wake-up call. So we're going to turn it over to her. And if you have any questions, please drop them into the chat box. We've got about 15 minutes at the end of her presentation to do a little bit of Q&A. So I'll be monitoring the chat box as we go, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So Ainsleigh, you can take it over here.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm just gonna get my screen shared real quick. Okay, I hope everybody can see it now. Anyways, okay, I'll do a little quick introduction. Thank you, Ariel. My name is Ainsleigh McKinlay. I'm currently a senior at the University of Washington. I'm studying both environmental studies and climate science at the moment. Over the summer, I participated in an internship with the Mass Center Aquarium where I both completed some internship tasks that the organization needed, as well as conducting some personal academic research for my senior capstone thesis. So yeah, super excited to share all of that with you today. My project, as Ariel mentioned, is called Coastlines to Classrooms, Marine Mammals as a Wake-Up Call for Transformative Environmental Education. All right, so first things first, what are marine mammals anyways? I'm sure most of us can maybe answer this question, but just to give a brief overview, marine mammals are animals like orcas and Pacific walruses. They are characterized as mammals because they have fur and they birth live young. A lot of people don't think of maybe orcas and seals and sea lions and all those fun little creatures as having fur, but little known fact, they actually do. So they're not just fascinating creatures, they're also critical indicators of ocean health. Everything from the southern resident killer whales of the Pacific Northwest to the Pacific walruses of the Arctic. These species are unfortunately facing mounting challenges from climate change to habitat loss to human interference. So my research mainly focused on how impacts on marine mammals have grown over time from kind of all of these separate sectors, alongside studying kind of how education and stewardship intersects and how that relationship might be really important for guiding future decisions so that we can have a future where climate change is maybe not so daunting of a threat. So yeah, first things first, we can go over some benefits of healthy oceans, why even if we don't find marine mammals very cute, although I do, even if we're not super interested in marine mammals, it's really important for all of us to understand how important our ocean is and all of the wonderful things that we get from it that maybe we wouldn't think of. So one thing I looked at with the ocean is how much it provides food security for people all around the globe. So whether you're landlocked, whether you're coastal, a lot of our food sources, a lot of our resources come from the ocean, and it's really important that we have a healthy ocean. One, for that food security aspect, and secondly, because a healthy ocean helps enrich food sources. So when we have a very nutrient dense ocean, and that only happens when our marine spaces are chemically balanced, which is really difficult with so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which I'll get to in a little bit. When our ocean is not chemically, nutriently balanced, the fish, the oysters, all of the awesome seafood that we get to eat actually does not have as much nutrition in it, as much protein in it. And that's just another reason why, especially for the people that solely rely on fish as a source of protein and nutrition, it's really important that we help take care of our oceans. And step one of that is making sure that our marine mammal populations are healthy. Another really important aspect of a healthy ocean is the economic side. So globally, marine assets bring in 24 trillion US dollars annually based off of all the different industries that happen in ocean spaces, all the way from fishing to ecotourism. And within that, these industries support 870 million employees, and a lot of these employees are coming from countries where marine economy is kind of their sole base economy, which is obviously very, very important for them to be able to rely on a healthy ocean. And last but not least, the ocean is our planet's largest carbon sink, which basically means that it intakes more carbon than it outputs. So we have both carbon sinks and carbon sources. And carbon sinks are very important because they are a natural way for our planet to regulate this influx of carbon that is coming from fossil fuel emissions and the growth of industry and everything like that. Um, Annually, the ocean absorbs 31% of that atmospheric carbon dioxide. So, if we don't have a healthy ocean to rely on for climate regulation, we are in a much worse position than if we take care of our resources now rather than having to backpedal and make amends later down the line, like we're kind of doing with climate change at the moment. Um, so, all of these are super important things to look at when we are looking at why it's important that we maintain a healthy ocean. And that again connects back to taking care of our marine mammals. So, as I said, these are the two questions that I kind of based my research on. At first, I was only trying to look at the growth of impacts on marine mammals because that's what I was more interested in at the time. Um, I grew up in San Diego by the beach, and I have always loved the ocean. I have always loved marine mammals, and I was really excited to get this internship and be able to work on this research project because it has been such a love of mine for so long. But I realized once I started the internship um, that this relationship between education and stewardship is just so significant that I felt like it deserved a place alongside the research I was doing. With the growing impacts because I really wanted to look at, okay, here's the objective issue, and here's what we're facing, which even though I'm pursuing an environmental degree right now, I even learned new things during this process. And that kind of also solidified the fact that it is so important to have this kinds of information kind of much more accessible than it already is because it's might be very important um for maintaining a level of stewardship that is impactful and positive for our environment. So, um as I was saying beforehand, marine mammals are super important for a healthy ocean, and a healthy ocean is super important for us as people and the world as a whole. um Unfortunately, though, as I'm sure we're all somewhat aware at least, marine mammals are facing pretty significant threats, mostly coming from both climate change and human interference. So, starting with climate change, warming temperatures, global warming, and we've all heard of it, is rapidly transforming marine ecosystems and most often for the worse. So, considering the Pacific walrus, as sea ice melts in unprecedented rates, these sea animals are forced to move further north, which disrupts their natural behaviors and ultimately threatens their survival. And this is just one example of something that a lot of marine mammals are facing. As you can see in this kind of news clipping that I have on the slide just from 2023, habitat degradation is a huge issue within marine mammal survival and marine mammal threats. Um, Not just the Pacific walrus, but multiple other marine mammals are being forced to kind of push their boundaries. due to warming oceans. And sometimes that means they're moving to colder waters because they can't physiologically survive at the temperature of the water that their historical habitat ranges were in. Other times it's because their food sources are altering their own habitat ranges. And even if the water is a habitable temperature for these marine mammals to survive, they now don't have a diet in the area that can support them. So they also kind of have to follow that food source potentially to a different habitat, meaning that their historical range is now kind of lost due to something that came out of climate change or human disturbance. Um, so another consequence of warming oceans alongside of this is the proliferation of harmful algal blooms. For short, they're called HABs. Um, so these blooms release neurotoxins that travel through the food chain. This leads to domoic acid poisoning in marine mammals. It most commonly affects California sea lions and cetaceans, like dolphins. So this leads to kind of like huge stranding events caused by these toxins, and it's becoming alarmingly common due to the kind of extreme growth of warming oceans. So it's a big issue in California right now. Um, they're facing some really warm coastal temperatures, and so harmful algal blooms kind of happen because a warmer ocean provides a perfect habitat for bacteria growth. And so basically, the bacteria and the algae just bloom under this really warm um, water event. And because it can be toxic when fish consume it, and then those marine mammals consume the fish, it builds up in their own bodies. And that leads to not just kind of like a small bout of illness, but unfortunately, it can be terminal because domoic acid poisoning targets the brain. And so once their brain is not able to function, they cannot sustain themselves. Um, and this is HABs are a somewhat natural occurrence, but the growing frequency at which we're seeing them occur at this point in time is now considered unnatural and is a consequence of warming temperatures. Um, so the domino effect we see in harmful algal blooms and this domoic acid poisoning moving through the food chain, these kinds of things, it doesn't just affect marine mammals, it doesn't just affect marine ecosystems, but it destabilizes the entire balance of the planet. Um, Secondly, human activities kind of further exacerbate these challenges. For example, southern resident killer whales, they rely on echolocation as a key means to both hunt and mate, which are very backbone behaviors for their survival. Southern resident killer whales are already a threatened species. That is mostly due to the decrease in Chinook salmon. I believe there has been a 60% decrease since the 1980s. And the southern residents are unique because their primary food source is actually Chinook salmon, whereas transients kind of they're the orcas that we think of more often when we think of orcas eating seals and sea lions and sharks. And while southern residents can dabble in other food sources, they really heavily rely on specifically Chinook salmon. So the growth of fishing and the subsequent loss of salmon from that, as partnered with habitat degradation and warmer temperatures for salmon habitats as well, these orcas are already really threatened in terms of food scarcity. And another threat that is really harmful to the survival of the orcas is boat traffic and vehicle traffic, because of the noise pollution that comes out of all of those activities. So, like I said, echolocation is a really key component of our southern resident orcas. And when you have so much noise pollution, when you have so much that's kind of interrupting their ability to communicate, they essentially lose their only means of communication. And because they operate in packs, they operate in groups, they don't usually operate solo. Um, it hugely threatens their ability to maintain their historical behaviors, which are essential for their future survival. So there is clearly a lot of issues in terms of what we think about as climate change, what we think about as human interference, kind of the growth of industry. Um, Something that is a little harder to find on the news, something that you don't hear about so often, maybe when you're scrolling through TikTok, or whether you're watching the news, or whether you're talking to somebody that lives by the beach. Um, Something that I actually learned this past summer, which is a little bit embarrassing to admit, but it kind of, raised the alarm bells of like, wow, okay, this really needs to be more common knowledge. About the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So essentially, the Marine Mammal Protection Act is a policy that makes sure that marine mammals are safe from human disturbance based on something called take. And take in this definition is kind of used for like hunting, killing, capturing, um, touching, disturbing. Um, so kind of a broader like definition of what we would usually consider take as, but the policy was first put in place in 1972, and it was enacted because Hawaiian monk seals and Florida manatees were two marine mammal populations that were like hugely threatened due to kind of like human interference. Um, Thankfully, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, or the MMPA for short, if you hear me say that, um, the MMPA actually successfully rebuilt both of these populations. So that is a huge success of this policy. Um, but obviously, we still face issues. Not a lot of people know about the MMPA, which is kind of a significant point of improvement for education in the future, as I kind of saw throughout my internship at the beach. But anyways, back to our harbor seals. So harbor seals face direct threats from human recreation. So not so much vehicle traffic, not so much fishing, not so much climate change, but actually direct human seal interactions. So during their critical nursing and breeding periods, seals rely on haul out sites to rest and feed their pups. Um, this behavior of hauling out is basically just going from the water to the shore to kind of rest or do something for a prolonged period of time, whether that is breeding, mating, feeding young, or just kind of resting with them, because harbor seal pups need a lot of rest on shore when they're first born. Um, so disturbance by humans, whether intentional or not, can cause mothers to actually abandon their seal pups, which leads to a really difficult situation for both us and the young seals, because obviously we do not want to go and cause further disturbance, but a young seal can't survive without its mother. So what usually has to happen is it needs to be transported to a marine hospital. Thankfully, we have one here in the Pacific Northwest, called SR3, and they rehabilitate harbor seals wonderfully, whenever they need to be. But we don't really want to have to take them to a marine mammal hospital. It would be best if we were able to teach people in Seattle and at some point more broadly that interacting with a harbor seal pup is dangerous. It could also be dangerous for us. We don't want diseases. Another issue is dogs too. We don't want dogs to go up to harbor seal pups. We don't want harbor seal pups to hurt dogs. Like there's just lots of liabilities. Basically, just leave them alone. Um, but I had never really thought of this piece of like direct interference, because usually what we're faced with is all of the kind of like bigger players. But on a small scale, on a local level, something that we can do as individuals who live in Seattle is we can make sure that we're not interacting with wildlife, and we can make sure that we're telling our friends and telling our family members that interacting with wildlife is actually much more harmful to them than you would think. And so that is essentially what I did with the Mast Center Aquarium over the summer. If I spoke to you, thank you so much for talking to me. I got to use these really cool skulls, these really cool pamphlets. I don't think you can read them on the slide. Maybe you can, but I also had this really cool kind of like banner next to me, telling people kind of the play-by-play of what to do when you see a harbor seal on the shore, because it is unfortunate like that. We love to use the beaches too. Harbor seals are mainly nursing and feeding over the summers. That's when they need the shores as well. So although we might want to, run around on the beach, swim in the ocean, do all the things that we'd love to do, um, it is very important that we keep a lookout for these little guys, and we make sure that they are getting just as much success out of the beach as we do. So something that I was also doing with the Mass Center Aquarium is I was working to kind of find out how we can improve education material so that it's more easily understandable across a lot of cultures or across a lot of languages, even between children and adults. Because, kids up until a certain point can't read. Not everybody in the world speaks English, and Redondo Beach is a big tourist site. And that became evident to me as I was speaking to people on the beach. I met a lot of people from places in South America. I met a lot of people from Russia, from Germany, and a lot of things that a lot of these people had in common were that they kind of at least struggled with English, or they couldn't converse with me at all. And that is something that I worked on with Ariel, is how we can kind of improve um, education material so that it's easily reachable and easily accessible. And this also became something I looked at during my research, was how to promote the accessibility of education so that we can make sure as many people are reaping the benefits as possible. Um, So, getting into how I conducted my research. So, again, if I spoke to you over the summers, I want to say thank you, because you actually helped me with my research a lot. Um, Over the summer, I talked to 913 people. Um, all of these conversations I kind of kept in mind. I stored a lot of information. I took a lot of notes. I was kind of aiming to understand the level of like public knowledge surrounding marine science. And I did that through observations while I was at the beach. I did that through library research. I did that through interviews and conversations. And I also conducted a survey that kind of aimed to test how much environmental education people had received in the past, and maybe how that influenced their perspectives on climate change, or some current issues that the environment and our marine spaces are facing. Um, so one of the questions that I asked on my survey was, are you familiar with the Marine Mammal Protection Act and what it prohibits? And less than half of the people who took my survey, I got 99 responses, so close to 100. Over half of the people that took my survey actually did not um, know what the Marine Mammal Protection Act was. And so that really solidified this idea that education, environmental education especially, it needs to be more accessible, and it needs to be easier for people to understand, and it needs to be made more interesting to enhance engagement. And this is kind of what really started furthering my research along. So from analyzing the responses of this question, it led me to also looking at this next question, which is, are you willing to make personal life changes for the benefit of marine life? 70.7% of people answered yes, and 29.3% of people answered no. I didn't quantify kind of the size of the change that I was asking people to sort of commit to. It was an optional question. And I also had a write-in box um, directly afterwards that said, if you answered the first question, um, what is one change that you would make? And so I got responses all the way from like becoming vegan to using less plastic utensils. Like it could have been anything you wanted it to be. I was not asking people to make a large change or really just tweak any large part of their lifestyle to benefit marine life. Um, so I decided to analyze how people that answered this question, either yes or no, behaved throughout the rest of my survey. And I kind of clumped together all of the questions that investigated environmental education and compared it between the participants of people who answered yes and no. So of the 70.7% of people who said that they would change their behavior. As you can see on the pie chart, 60% of them had received prior environmental education, whereas 40% of people had not. This was pretty surprising to me. I kind of expected that there would be a little bit more environmental education present. But what was even more surprising to me was this next pie chart that represents the 29.3% of people who were unwilling to make any changes. And this represents a staggering 80% of people who had not received previous environmental education. Um, this is kind of what surprised me was how strong the correlation is between education and stewardship, because I I'm somebody who grew up even before having received really any formal education. I love the ocean. I love animals. I love the earth. That's something that's very, I think, innate to me and something that I was born with in my heart. So I've always had a difficult time understanding why certain people don't care about these issues. And that's why this project was so um, meaningful and so interesting to me, is because I finally kind of got to quantify the answer to that question. Um, and to me, it kind of shines this light at the end of the tunnel of like, hey, if we can maybe enhance our education system, we have a real possibility at making sure our future generations are prepared better than we were to handle this climate crisis that we're now facing. Um, so all to say, I thought that these results were pretty significant. I also decided to look at this other question, which is, what is your level of concern regarding climate change? Um, and the graph for that is on this next slide. The education choices that I put for people, as you can see on the graph, is some high school degrees or high school diplomas, some college degrees, and graduate degrees. As you can see, I had participants from every level of education. I decided to ask, I gave them an option of unconcerned, concerned, or extremely concerned. I also did have an option that said, I do not believe in climate change. I had two respondents actually choose that response, but for the purpose of compiling it into a graph, I decided to loop that into the unconcerned category. So unconcerned represents people who quite literally do not care about climate change, as well as people who don't believe that it exists. Something that really surprised me is the amount of people who are unconcerned, of the people who had a college degree. I thought that that was very surprising to me. And so this kind of led me to reevaluating the strong correlation that I saw within my pie charts because I was like, okay, well, if you have graduate degrees over here that are saying that they're really not that concerned about climate change, um, is the issue really education? And so that's what led me back to kind of dissecting my data more and more and more. And I came to the conclusion that yes, there is definitely a strong correlation between education and stewardship. However, that does not necessarily relate to the level of schooling that somebody achieved. What I mean by this is I technically fall into the some college category at the moment. It's also important to note that my survey mainly reached it went through people at the aquarium. It was dispersed through the newsletter. I dispersed it through the University of Washington. I also gave it to friends who gave it to family members. So it reached a little ways away. But most of the people I would say that took my survey are people who are in school with me, who are probably pursuing an environmental degree, or adults who have been out of college and have been out of college for a long time. Um, and this is something that made sense to me in terms of looking at the um, metrics between like obviously a lot of people who are in college at the moment are extremely concerned versus a lot of people who are unconcerned with college degrees. Um, and it was important for me to look at age because environmental education is not something that has been mainstream for a very long time. Um, I have been lucky to grow up in an era where it was easy for me to access quality environmental education. But in terms of talking about people like my parents who are nearing their 50s, people who are older than that, it was much less common to be getting an environmental degree. Alongside that, it was nearly unheard of to be receiving kind of environmental science education in like high school or middle school or elementary school. Um, and so this kind of led me to making the conclusion of yes, there is a very significant relationship between education and stewardship, but it does not necessarily relate to the level of school. Um, it is much more significant in terms of the quality and the accessibility of environmental education. So going forward, those are really key things to focus on is how do we make environmental education accessible and how do we make it of quality enough to promote this kind of future generation of stewardship that we would love to see. Um, And alongside doing the survey and doing the interviews and doing the observations, I also conducted a little bit of library research that allowed me to contextualize kind of just like how much these impacts have grown. Um, and these are just some metrics that I found were really important to quickly digest. Um, as I talked about with the harmful algal blooms, they are rising in frequency. Vehicle traffic has increased 3,200% just since 1975. And that is a very extreme metric, especially when considering what we talked about earlier with our southern resident killer whales. If this keeps increasing at the rate that we're seeing it increase at the moment, um, that is hugely harmful to the future of our orcas. And also this metric that I haven't mentioned yet is this 300,000 annual cetacean deaths due to entanglements. Um, so I know we've all heard of the turtles and the straws and the turtles getting stuck in the like Coke can separators, soda separators. Um, that's important, of course. It's also important to understand how those issues might be affecting all of the other animals in the ocean beyond just sea turtles. because I know it's a very common belief for people because it was used as a marketing strategy. Um, for people to think that turtles are like really hugely threatened by plastic and pollution and other marine mammals or other animals in general kind of aren't, and that is just very much not the case. So a cetacean, for people who don't know, is a like whale or a dolphin. Um, so this 300,000 number is just pertaining to whales and dolphins. Sorry about that. And entanglements is ranging from anything like plastic to fishing wire to other kind of like fishing gear and stuff like that. Um, and alongside the 300,000 cetaceans, tens of thousands of pinnipeds, which are our sea lions and our seals, also face deathly entanglements. Um, so before I get into these big ideas moving forward, I want to also mention that although I didn't end up using a lot of the actual statistics and data that I received from this particular aspect of my research, it was really important in how I kind of built my perspective around doing this research. And that is, I studied abroad in Costa Rica for a month in September, and I decided to take my research with me there as well. So while I was there, I also conducted a few interviews, more casual interviews than the ones I did here, um, and kind of just engaged in conversations that were um, that focused on kind of ecotourism and environmentalism and nature and what that means to them, because I also wanted to look at cultural differences in terms of education, because it's something that led me to making one of my final opinions in terms of these big ideas moving forward. If you can see the tab that says experiential learning. The way I got here is I have always been very interested in traditional ecological knowledge and kind of indigenous schooling systems and how a lot of their cultures kind of promote this relationship between the earth and the child while they're learning about environmental education. And that's what creates this very strong bond and very strong sense of stewardship for their environment. Um, so while I was in Costa Rica, I decided to really kind of investigate the roots of maybe cultural ties to nature. Um, so I was living with a Costa Rican family, and I was talking to them about how they how they would describe their relationship with the environment, how they would describe their upbringing in terms of maybe what led them to having that relationship with the earth. Something that was very obvious when I was speaking to them is that they kind of view the environment and the earth at large as something that is a part of them as well, rather than separate, which is kind of what we were raised in as a Western culture. So we're mostly taught this is the earth, this is something that exists alongside of you. This is what the animals do, this is how they work, this is how the trees work, this is how the weather works. We're taught biology, we're taught life sciences, but that kind of ends once the textbook closes. That is what I wanted to make sure I did not promote coming out of my research. And speaking with people in Costa Rica kind of solidified this idea that experiential learning is something that is so hugely important for the future of environmental education. Just wanted to explain that bit of my research before I move into talking about why these big ideas are so important. So number one, standardization. Standardization is excruciatingly important in terms of the future. As you can see on the slide, only 15 states have bills that encourage climate education as of 2023. And this is not the most frightening thing that I learned about environmental education in the US. Um, Beyond just not having states or not having bills that encourage education, and reminder, this is just encourage, not mandate. So these 15 states don't need to have climate education. They are just encouraged by law. Um, but alongside of that, sorry if you hear my dog. Alongside of that, there was a report in 2020 that revealed that there is only one US state that earned an A for its environmental education curriculum. And what earned an A means is that all 50 states were evaluated for their quality of environmental education if they promote it in schools. Wyoming is the only one who earned a satisfactory score. Every single other state kind of fell below requirements for even being successful in teaching environmental education. Some states among the worst were Texas and Pennsylvania. I believe they both received an F, among other states. But as I said, standardization is extremely important. It is equally as important for people living in Oklahoma to understand what they rely on and how much of that comes from a healthy ocean and how much of that relies on a healthy atmosphere. All of these things are really key concepts for people globally to understand. It's not only important that our children in Seattle know about the ocean, it is equally important everywhere, and that is why standardization is key moving forward. Alongside of this, as I mentioned, experiential learning is really important. There's a lot of benefits of experiential learning. It fosters a deeper relationship with nature. It enhances learning and memory. It improves mental health. It's been known to be extremely effective in mental health in children, especially. And so, if we incorporate these two ideas moving forward as we look at kind of how to enhance environmental education going forward, if we rely on standardization and promoting experiential learning, um, then we really have what we need to make sure that our future is in the hands of good caretakers. Um, Most of you, if not all of you, have experienced experiential learning before. The Mast Center Aquarium does a lot of experiential learning. What I did over the summer counts as experiential learning. If you spoke to me and I taught you about a skull, if you spoke to me and I pointed out a porpoise that was in the ocean, you have participated in experiential learning. And I hope that those moments stuck with you. And they made you remember maybe the size of a walrus because it's pretty crazy. Or maybe what the skull of a harbor seal looks like. All of those things are really important things to just be like, oh yeah, I remember that. And last but not least, as a final kind of deliverable of what I did for the aquarium, as I mentioned, I was working with Ariel and how to make sure that educational material is widely accessible for all people. I drew and produced a kind of like a card, as you see here, that shows the dorsal fin and the saddle patch of every single southern resident killer whale, along with their name and their identification number. And this is going to be paired with a orca family tree that another intern of theirs put together. And so kind of bounce between these for a few seconds so that you can see just kind of how significant some of the differences between our orcas are. Um, And so this can serve as something that is widely accessible. Children can understand what this is trying to say. People who don't speak English are able to engage in this material. So I'm hoping that in the future, environmental education stands on the foundation of ideals that more align with the Mass Center Aquarium and this idea that I'm promoting of experiential learning. As a closing message before questions, I'd just like to mention, as throughout the rest of my presentation, I've been saying how extremely crucial it is to make sure that we're doing our part to save our marine life. Each one of us has a responsibility to make sure that we're doing what we can to protect our ocean, and that starts with you. Um, so thank you so much for listening. I am free to answer any questions, and I would be very happy to engage with anything you'd like me to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ainsley, for all this amazing information.
Yeah, of
I,
course.
as a marine educator slash environmental educator, I love the graphs and like having that like, validated results behind some of the stuff that we do.
Yeah, it made me pretty frustrated at first, and then I was like, no, it can be good. It can be good.
So, you talked about your questions and your internship and collecting this data. As you were collecting it, did you have anybody that was like, "No, I'm not taking this survey because like I don't believe in marine education," or like it's I don't care, or was it more of like people were like, "Yes, like I'll take this survey for you."
Um, I didn't have anybody that blatantly refused to kind of engage with me. There were a few people, maybe not alongside like the survey per se, but there were a few people when I was tabling this summer that would come up to me and either say that they thought I was selling skulls and were disappointed when I wasn't, and in fact, rather teaching. They kind of got frustrated and they'd be like, "Oh, you don't need to teach that. Like that's better for money," or something like that. Um, but of the people who actually kind of like engaged with me and participated in conversation, all of them, even if most people, if not everyone, also very readily admitted that they didn't really know anything, which I thought was admirable because I'm not one to really admit that I don't know things. Um, but the most I had in terms of rejection was maybe somebody would scan the QR code and I know that they weren't going to remember or like weren't going to take it. But people were at least respectful enough and interested enough to engage before they left.
Nice. Awesome. So with your methods, right? So you out on Rotondo, what were some of the most interesting questions you received while you were trying to educate the public? That one, I would say the ones that don't know a lot, or even the ones that do know a lot, but we're still asking questions that might have been like a misconception or something.
Good question. Let me think for a second. I did think it was really interesting how most people actually didn't know that we had different. Actually, every single person that I spoke to did not know that we had walruses in the Pacific Northwest, um, or that we had elephant seals. Both of those things, I remember a couple that came up to me who lived in Redondo Beach when I was talking about one of the elephant seal skulls, and they had said that they thought that elephant seals didn't like leave the Arctic. So that was a very common, like nobody knew that elephant seals were anywhere near us. Um, Another thing is a lot of people didn't know that there was a difference between the different orca populations. So most people knew about like L pod and J pod and K pod, which I feel like is pretty common if you live in Seattle. It's kind of hard to escape maybe knowing about that, but a lot of people didn't know that there were like transient versus southern residents or southern residents versus like offshore orcas. Nobody knew what an offshore orca was. Um, I also got a lot of questions about what people were diving for. outside of the aquarium, which at first I did not know how to answer because I had no idea what people were diving for. But I did learn that most of it is because there is a Pacific red octopus that lives in the rowboat that is underneath the pier. So I thought that was cool. He's like apparently 6 foot wingspan.
Yeah, we are kind of a hotspot for octopus, both our red octopus and our giant Pacific for
Mhm.
sure. But so going back to these, you're talking about people being here in Redondo or being in the area who don't know that elephant seals are here, even though one was spotted this last year on Des Moines
Right.
Beach. Or like the orcas and how we have the different ecotypes. Um, Going back to what you were talking about with this whole accessibility piece. And I guess how do we get people out in nature and have these experiential learning when they feel like they already kind of know everything because they grew up here? How do we actively seek out or try to engage those people in their own backyard, in their own environment?
That's a great question. Most of my research focused on how we can implement these kinds of systems within school systems. So the what I kind of encouraged in terms of that route is having nationally standardized and mandated environmental education alongside kind of curating experiences like aquarium programs and beach cleanups or maybe like weeding, things like that to get kids' hands in the earth to really understand that they have a direct impact. But as for people who are not in the school system, or maybe are a little bit stuck up when it comes to environmental education, I think that the key here is appealing to interests in a way that isn't flat out like, come learn about harbor seals or come learn about elephant seals, but rather like, oh, do you like to fish? Maybe let's create a Saturday afternoon where we get a bunch of people who love to fish and we offer them, provided food, provided drinks, and then within that kind of activity, you're able to engage in conversation. That way, it's not so much of a blatant, like, sit down and let me talk at you and let me teach you, but rather an experience where whether or not they're aware that they're engaging with their environment, they are like straight up seeing that whether they realize it or not, the fish that they're catching are only being caught because the ecosystem works the way it does. And so that can be a good way to show people who are maybe a little bit more unwilling to learn how important it is that we understand the reciprocal relationships of nature. Obviously, that's just um, an example, but I think having activities like that that aren't branded as education, but what comes out of it is kind of an inspiration for wanting to learn more about your surroundings.
I think definitely offering free food, you get a lot of people.
Oh
I mean, you
yeah,
catch me
definitely.
going just for that free food too. But yeah,
Right.
I definitely understand of approaching them a little bit different so that you're not coming at them as an educator, you're coming to them as like a friend who just wants to
Right.
have that conversation. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Um so talking about the standardization, do you think by standardizing the materials or the curriculum that one, it would open up accessibility, but also make it easier to actually teach in the schools as like a teacher from, I grew up in the Midwest. We did not have like real environmental education, let alone like ocean or climate change, taught in the schools. Do you think that would just make that accessibility piece easier overall, both for students and for teachers?
I think having a federal piece to it where it's like federally mandated will help with accessibility because there were a lot of studies that I read um, where teachers have been pushing for a long time for better material for environmental education because one issue with it not being kind of like a um, federal system right now is that teachers who want to teach environmental education or teachers who are encouraged to teach environmental education don't have any of the resources that they would need in order to do that because their school doesn't have the funding to give them those resources because that funding isn't coming from the government, as it is for their other courses. So I think on a large scale, having that federal piece kind of integrated into the mandatory education would help a lot with accessibility. I also think then if you have that groundwork accessibility laid out, then you can start making moves towards having more language accessibility and more disability accessibility once you have kind of the flat out, here is what I would need as somebody who is completely able-bodied, speaking English, can understand. Once you have those things, I think you can start reaching for kind of the like fruit of the trees. And then it'll just keep building from there.
Yeah. So you were just mentioning about accessibility when it comes to languages and able bodies. Um, I'm thinking like back to you were said that Washington is not on one of the most successful environmental education lists, that we didn't get that A grade when we've got this beautiful environment around us. I mean, we've got high deserts to mountains to our ocean right here. We've got almost all of it, right? Uh, is is that accessibility to language and getting people who are, differently able than us out into that environment? Do you think that's a component as to why Washington isn't up there on the list and reaching that A grade, is because of the lack of funding or lack of like physical accessibility for our students to engage?
I think physical accessibility is definitely an issue, although honestly, I think that the barrier that is most significant in a state like Washington is money. And I see that even as a college student myself, like I grew up in San Diego. I'm coming from a place where I also received environmental education when I was a child. I have parents who took me out and into the environment and really kind of cultivated that relationship for me. And I was very lucky in doing that. But if I didn't have the financial ability to be able to sustain my education here at the University of Washington, I wouldn't know even maybe half of the things that I know right now. And that is something that is directly behind a paywall. And beyond Washington, I think that is a huge issue everywhere, is that kids maybe whose parents can't pay for camps, they're not getting that same relationship with the environment as their friends who do get to go to camp, or things like that. So beside physical accessibility, where maybe engaging with like being in the ocean is not always on the table, or hiking to the top of the mountain is not always on top of on the table. Even beyond that, I think having the money to even think about those experiences is something that a lot of people aren't talking about, and a lot of people need to talk about.
Definitely. So you mentioned, you being in college and having these experiences, thinking back to your survey results, and how the ones who seem to have the college degree having that kind of that age correlation of being out of the education or learning centers for so long, that they didn't have the sort of education that we had of environmental literacy, or even, ocean literacy plus climate change literacy. So do you see a hope for the future as like your generation is now in the education system, that you're getting access to this education, that, and the next following generations will have more that are actually very concerned for the environment and becoming activists and becoming stewards? Do you see kind of that trend or that shift happening?
I definitely do. And that's another reason why this research became so important to me, is because I had never thought about really the connection between education and the kind of having a passion for the environment, because as I mentioned earlier, it's something that I have kind of always leaned towards. And so I never looked inwards at myself and maybe how the education I received might have been informing that. But I mean, I remember when I gave my survey to my parents and my grandma, actually, all of them, it came back to me and they were like, we have never learned about environmental education. And these are all people who like, you know, they also love the environment just as much as I do. They just have less education to back it up with. Um, and I had a lot of people also when I spoke with them at Redondo Beach who were saying that they wished that they had received this kind of information when they were in school because it was not only something that you didn't have handed to you, but it was something that you couldn't even look for. Um, and I think that my generation coming out of it, remembering my survey results, the people who were currently enrolled in college had the lowest number of people who were in the unconcerned category, followed with people who were in high school or having received high school degrees. And so I think that shift coming from people who are older but having received higher levels of education, being more concerned really purely comes from an age standpoint where they just weren't um, they either didn't have a reason to be concerned because they were living in a time that was less threatened than we are now. And then alongside of that, they didn't just have access to it in the way that we do now. And so I see a lot of hope in the future um, in terms of enhancing environmental education and having that be really important for raising future generations that are as, if not more, concerned as people my age are.
Well, what a great way to wrap up the end of this talk, then that kind of uplifting message there. Uh, I just want to say personally, thank you, Ainsleigh, for all the stuff that you did here for us at the Mass Center and for sharing your results and your talk and your passion with the rest of the community here. But again, thank you so much. And thank you for all of those who have watched this. If you do have any questions, you can keep posting them in the chat box and we'll get to them at a later date. But all right, everyone, we'll see you next time with Science on the Sound.
Thank you.